Well, hey everybody, welcome back to our Module 2 lecture. I appreciate your hard work getting started with the course in Module 1. And before we get into the lecture, I've got a couple of quick reminders for assignments. First of all, for each week, your main discussion board post is due on Saturday before midnight. And then your secondary post, which is a response to your classmate, that's due on Sunday before midnight. And it's structured that way to give everybody time to make the response post without having to stay up until midnight on Sunday waiting for procrastinating poster that you could respond to. So please remember those that turnaround time and please post your first post by Saturday night. This week's module is focusing on difficult passages, specifically passages that are often used to challenge women in pulpit ministry, the notion of women being used in pulpit ministry or in any leadership role over men in the church context. And so, a big part of what we're trying to accomplish in this class is for you to be able to articulate a biblically based apologetic or scriptural explanation for women in ministry. That's like a huge goal of what we're trying to achieve. And so that's why we're doing the research paper, so you can study this out for yourself. By the way, one more reminder, if you didn't sign up for your research paper or for your interview, please pause this video and do it right now. And also, if you haven't started your reading for the required wellness and longevity book, that begins this week. So be sure you've purchased that book and prepare for what's due with this module. If you've got any questions about these assignments or any other questions about the course, please make sure, first of all, you've watched lecture 1 because I explained all of it there, and you've thoroughly read the syllabus. And if you can't figure it out between the two of those, feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so for today, we're going to talk about one of these challenging passages, and that's going to be 1 Timothy 2 and 12. Now, you're going to read about this in your Corin book. You'll also read a paper that I wrote about this passage as a UGSC student. This week, you're actually reading about more than one challenging passage, but we're just going to focus on one in the lecture as well as in your discussion board. Okay, so the King James Version states it as, "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And so in your readings, you'll find information related to the cultural context in which this passage was written in the Corn book as well as in my paper. And there's a lot of evidence that seems to indicate that First Timothy was written in response to a church in Ephesus with many problems. Timothy's trying to lead and Paul is trying to help. Some of the problems that they're experiencing that we know they must be experiencing because we see them addressed in this book. We see leaders being kicked out of church. We see false teachers. We see angry men. We see women dressing immodestly. And apparently, there were women who were usurping authority. Now, you've got reading on this topic, and then some of you will even be writing your papers on this very passage. So you'll have lots of access to an abundance of research. But for those who aren't focusing on this particular passage, really for all of us, I'd just like to guide you. I'd like to guide you in your study in this lecture by discussing some key questions that are related to the passage. So I'm going to start with a fundamental question that is related to biblical interpretation in general for any passage. And when you come to Scripture, when you're studying a passage, there's just no way around it. You have to answer this question. Okay, you ready for it? Okay, so the question is, does this passage have universal application, meaning it applies to every person in every context across time? Or, on the other hand, does this passage have limited application, meaning It primarily applies to a specific situation, and other readers who were not in the immediate context, right? The people who initially received the when it was initially written or initially heard it, but maybe you came after that. Maybe you can apply those principles from the specific teachings to your lives. Okay, that would be limited. It's saying that it was written directly for a specific situation. And so that specific situation may not apply directly to you, but you could possibly learn principles that you could apply to your life. If you took hermeneutics, you've heard of this before. So this isn't new. So for example, just to kind of refresh your memory, to give you an example of each of those. Okay, so John 3:16, that's a universal passage because this verse says, "For God so loved the world." It's not just for God so loved the Jews or God so loved the Gentiles or God so loved the church in Jerusalem, but it's God so loved the world. So in the context of the verse, we see that it expands not just to those people who are immediately hearing it, but even to us today. Another very familiar passage to you will be Acts chapter 2, verses 38 and 39. That's also universal because the passage says, "For the promise is to you and to your children and to all who are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call." So we know that the experience that they had on the day of Pentecost, it tells us right there in verse 39 that this is a universal promise because it's not just for their context. It defines it and describes it right there in the context of Scripture. Okay, so those are examples of universal application. Okay, now the opposite of that, as for a passage with limited application, I would say that 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 7 is an example of a passage with limited application. This is when Paul says that he wishes everyone was single like him. Okay, so Paul is talking about being single, and he's speaking about the liberty that he has to minister more freely as a single person. But he's not requiring everyone who is in ministry to be single. Okay, so he is it's limited. Well, let me tell you, it's not limited. The concept applies to us. He's you can I mean, I can attest to that. When I was a single woman, I could minister more freely. um I had just life was just different. I had different responsibilities. I had a lot more freedom to choose the path that I would follow with my life. So in that regard, it applies to me. But the reason it's limited application, he's not making a command. He's not saying that if you want to be in ministry, you must be single. This is the path that you must follow. So that's how we could say this is an example of limited application. You could take the principle and apply it to your own life, but it's not a command for everyone. Okay, so think about that, the contrast between universal application or limited application. And in order to determine whether a passage has universal application or if it has limited application, you've got to ask yourself some pretty important questions. So, any passage that you read in Scripture, it's always being written initially to a specific audience. You've heard all this before as well in hermeneutics. Um, but the question that to follow up with that, we know that it was written to a specific audience, but is it addressing something unique to them? Okay, that's really what you're asking yourself. Is this being written to a specific situation that is unique to them, or does it relate to me as well? Is it a command for me as well? And in my paper, there are several questions that I ask to help determine whether 1 Timothy 2:12 is universal or is it limited. So, and I'm just going to kind of, I write more about these. You can kind of flesh this out. Certainly in my paper, also in Brother Corns. But one question is, does this passage refer to women or to wives? Well, that you may think, what's the difference? Well, if it's women, is it talking about roles in the home? If it's wives, is it talking about roles in the home? If it's women, is it a general prohibition against women, all women in ministry? Or is it talking about how we relate in terms of the context in a marriage context? Another question that I ask is, does it mean to learn in silence, or does it mean that women should learn quietly? Now, I just like to make a point here. I don't want to gloss over the fact that Paul actually said something radical for his day here. The point was that women should learn. Okay, so please don't lose that point. And please don't let it be lost in the debate here. He's never saying that women shouldn't learn, but we have to determine in what way is he saying. Then another question to ask is submission to whom or what? Okay, so is this passage saying that the women in question should submit to a person, or is it talking more about self-control, having self-control and submission in that regard, submitting to God? And then another question I ask, what is the nature of the teaching that it's speaking to? Okay, so is it saying you can't teach at all if you're a woman? Or is it saying, well, you can teach, but you can't teach in a domineering manner? And there's actually a lot of research related to the fact that there were women who were trying to teach in the same way that they did when they were involved with the pagan temples before converting to Christianity. And then another question that I ask to determine whether it's universal or limited in its application, what does authentain mean? Okay, so to answer that question, sometimes you have to do word study to figure that out. This is what you're going to do in your papers, right? So the question is, does authentain mean to have authority, or does it mean to lead in a domineering, inappropriate way? Now, of course, you're going to need to study this out more for yourself, but for the sake of time and just again, like I said, just to give a little bit of direction, I'll sort of cut to the chase with my perspective. And I would say that over a third of the verses in the book of First Timothy are occupied with false teaching. Okay, so Timothy's in a bit of trouble, and Paul is trying to circle the wagons and help him out in his leadership. And when you study out these false teachings that Timothy is speaking to, many of these false teachings have a direct correlation with the teachings of the Artemis cult in Ephesus. And that was a female-led cult that many of these new Christians were saved out of. They converted from this cult of Artemis there in Ephesus and became Christians. So the context to which Paul wrote, it necessitated him countering specific heresies that were rampant in the Ephesian church. So basically, he wasn't just writing to say, hey, here's some random thoughts that I was just thinking. I'm just going to put these out. I'm just going to tell you what I think, how I think churches should be run out of the blue. That wasn't what he was doing. He was speaking to specific heresies, specific conflicts, specific struggles that Timothy was facing, and he was trying to shore up uh, the the way that church was being run there, and really trying to address their problems. So he was writing to counter specific heresies. Some of them were being taught by women who had been immersed in the pagan female goddess cults of that particular area and that time, which is not surprising why he would talk about the need for modesty in dress when he's talking to these women as well, because again, they were coming from a different lifestyle, a different way of leading, a different way of in terms of power structure and showy and flashy. And so he's speaking to all of these sorts of things. Paul is trying to correct the women who were spreading these ideas and to encourage Timothy to create an environment where everyone could learn proper doctrine and beliefs so that these heresies don't continue. So, from my perspective, I would say that these verses, that this passage in particular, is not trying to limit all women for all times from holding any authoritative positions in any churches. So, in that regard, I would say that it does not have a universal application, but I would say that it would be limited in regards that it's speaking to a specific situation, specific crises, if you will, at the church in Ephesus. But I do believe there are principles that we can glean, especially as women in ministry. There are principles from this passage that we can glean. And so that's what limited application means. It means we take those principles that are relevant to us and we apply them in our own lives. Okay, so I hope this lecture has been helpful with this one difficult passage that we're beginning with. And I also really hope that you'll spend more time studying out this passage for yourself so you can give an answer when questioned. So remember, when you're doing your discussion board, please be sure to cite something from the lecture, also cite from your readings. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Have a great day. God bless you.